we're going to now hear an interview that's with Eliza Mondegreen and Zan Dalio. We're going to hear from Eliza Mondegreen. She's a graduate student researching the beliefs of affirmative clinicians, so affirming gender identity ideology, as well as the ways questions and doubts are handled in online trans and de-trans communities.
You've attended 3 conferences since last year, since we talked last year, one in Montreal, one in Ireland, and the latest in Denver. And I'd like to use a quote from your wonderful article in Unheard, The Secret Life of Gender Clinicians. So tantalizing, I like the title. Okay, so you wrote, after years of flying under the radar, the field of transgender healthcare is facing serious questions about whether minors can consent to life-altering interventions. What role factors like autism, sexual orientation, and social influence may play in the explosion of children and young people identifying as trans. And what to make of the mounting evidence of medical harm, regret, and transition. In response, the field of trans healthcare is becoming ever more secretive. At these conferences, the big questions confronting transgender healthcare hardly feature. Instead, these conferences serve at a different purpose, to shore up the faithful and cultivate a revolutionary vanguard with medicine. To this end, the proceedings revolve around a strange set of parables, that of the good gender clinician and the bad gender clinician. So with that, what does a good gender clinician and a bad one look like?
So the basic outline of these 2 parables, the good and the bad gender clinician, they're basically a way of educating providers into what they should bring to their encounters with patients. And a good gender clinician is basically defined by his or her credulity in terms of basically whatever the patient brings into the exam room, whatever embodiment goals the patient expresses, and that's one of their favorite terms, the clinician should go along with it. And the mark of a bad gender clinician, and this is made very explicit throughout all 3 conferences, they feel, quote, an entitlement to know the reasons why a patient feels the way that he or she does. They feel like they can discern the underlying causes of gender distress. They leave a door open for desistance, which we should remember used to be the most common outcome before gender clinicians started interfering early in puberty with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And these kind of parables keep unfolding, and they'll talk about, okay, how does a good gender clinician and a bad gender clinician react to a complicated patient who comes in, maybe with a case history of, so in Denver, there was this example of how to get informed consent from a very complicated patient. And the patient was autistic, had a schizophrenia diagnosis, had a learning disability, had a recent psychiatric hospitalization, identified as a demi-boy, and desired a hysterectomy and a phalloplasty, which are 2 of the most extreme of these, menu of interventions. And the presenters, walked the audience through what a good gender clinician does in the situation, which is that they will find a way to get to consent. They will find a way. There's no barrier too great, and that includes a learning disability, that includes the autism, that includes the patient having unrealistic ideas about surgery, that includes the schizophrenia diagnosis. All of these things can and should be overcome so that the patient can meet her embodiment goals. A bad gender clinician, on the other hand, is someone who's going to bring what would be conceptualized as, her reservations or her hangups into the exam room. And so she may feel uncomfortable being asked to cut the breasts off of an autistic teenage girl. She needs to get over that. She shouldn't let that stand in the way of her patients getting the care that the patient believes that they need. That's kind of the basic outline of those 2.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you answered my next few questions, right? That whole role-playing thing. So are there, how does the bad clinician, find his or her peeps in these conferences. I mean, conferences are about coming together, you know, and if it's got this cult-like bad clinicians there at these conferences, do they identify themselves, or how does that work?
I mean, I think that there are always people present who are kind of less committed to affirmation in all scenarios. But that is the tenor of the conferences overall. And those people don't tend to be the ones presenting and don't tend to be the ones who are, you know, trumpeting their views. But I'm sure that there are people who feel, you know, not completely comfortable. They're going through this process of kind of this attempt to re-educate them into this more flexible position toward affirmation.
Do they ever have these bad clinicians? Do they ever express their reservations? Have you heard any? And what sort of reception they got, or what kind of interaction between the goods and the bads there were?
Yeah. I mean, the social pressure is pretty strong to be positive about transition. So I can think of 2 instances in the 3 conferences where people brought up reservations or serious questions of any kind. So one was regarding the inclusion of eunuchs in the Standards of Care 8 that the World Professional Association for Transgender Health released in 2022. There were several people who felt really uncomfortable with this. Interestingly, they couched their discomfort in the use of language around eunuchs and not the actual concept that there could be, for example, child eunuchs, or that, you know, that this is some kind of like gender identity that the medical system should be validating by castrating healthy men. So they focused entirely on the language. And it was interesting because usually in these conferences, the clinicians are, you know, wanting to use the language that the community uses and not to impose a language on anybody else. But they were really uncomfortable with the language that eunuchs use. And the language eunuchs use is they will say castration rather than like gender affirming nullification surgery, or and so all of the objections were on that level. The other thing that I think people were uncomfortable with was there was a session about how to work with patients who claim to have multiple personalities, who also desire transition. A number of fairly wild case scenarios were enrolled during the session. Like, okay, what if you have a bunch of different personalities in one patient and they have conflicting goals for hormones and surgeries? How do you do that?
You mean, I'm thinking of the movie Sybil, where,
right,
like, because not my world, you know, psychology, psychiatry. So basically, okay, I'm fighting with myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you know, like they think that their patients are. So what if patients disagree about getting a mastectomy, for example? How do you work that out? And there were no questions about this really concerning part of the session. The only question that came up in that session, that was a kind of a serious question, was a woman about my age who was a therapist and had blue or purple or some kind of, you know, very colorful hair. And she said, you know, you've talked a lot about people having alters that are a different age, or they have different, you know, kind of psychiatric background, or maybe they speak a different language, but like, what about if somebody has like a transracial alter? And the response to that was that, you know, nobody wanted to talk about it, that was still really like way overboard, even though we could talk about people having animal alters. So those were really like the only moments of kind of uncomfortable questioning. And as you can see, neither of those are really like serious questions like about consent, the diagnostic criteria. Any of those like more serious issues are not coming up that I've seen in these conferences. That's just not what they're about.
Yeah,
You buy 90% of the way in, and then you have a question about the last 10%.
Yeah, and that, you know, you say in the article, you said earlier on, you know, it's really about just you know, kind of going along with this and not asking what you would think a clinician would ask as in terms of just basic ethics of, well, you know, what of these different pathologies is actually should be prioritized, you know, and none of that's being discussed, you know, the autism.
I mean, something like that will be discussed, but it's discussed in a compartmentalizing way. So it will be like, well, people can have trauma or schizophrenia or can be psychotic and still be transgender. And that you just have to be able to kind of hold these things together and separately and not let them interfere with the kind of the command to affirm the gender.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's mind-boggling. I mean, even I had to even look up the word demi-boy. I mean, yeah, and I'm on Twitter, you know, it's like, what does that mean?
Yeah. I think it means somebody who probably shouldn't be having a hysterectomy and a phalloplasty.
I guess, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned also in the article about there was a public relations specialist who was a presenter, I believe, who
Yeah.
was cautioning clinicians. So they've got a public relations person. So what, I mean, I guess goes back to the articles, like the secret lives. So what are we hearing, and what, you know, and what's not, what are we not hearing, I guess?
Sure. So there were actually 3 separate sessions at the most recent US PATH conference in Denver that were related to public relations. So it's obviously a keen interest of this field is how do we talk about what we do? And the answer is basically the public relations advice is that you should talk about it in ways that don't freak people out. The way that this particular, one of the main presenters put it was the dinosaurs are scared. So normal people are scared when they hear about kids maybe having surgeries, kids making irreversible decisions. And that doesn't mean that maybe we're not doing the right thing, or maybe we haven't convinced the public that this is a good idea. It means we need to not tell the public things that will scare them. And so the advice would be things like, okay, don't talk about ages and don't talk about surgeries and don't be specific. And like that, unfortunately, it was like really, I'm trying to remember what he said exactly. It was like, unfortunately, it's harmful, or unfortunately, it's not productive, or something to go into details about the work that we do. You have to present a picture that people will be on board with. And so they said, rather than call it even something like gender affirming care, which people don't know. And he said, when people hear the term gender affirming care, they think trans kids in the driver's seat. And he was like, and we hear trans kids in the driver's seat and we think that's really great, but you know, the public doesn't feel that way. So it's better to be more euphemistic and say, you know, it's essential healthcare. And just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, so don't give the public too much information to make their own judgments.
Right. What else can you tell us about this? Anything else about these conferences, or generally, because you talked about, you know, you started well, I don't exactly know when you started working on this, but you were reporting on a WPATH conference this time last year, pretty much. So, you know, can you make some comparisons between the last presentation and now, or something that's just blown your mind at this point about it? Or yeah.
I would say, like, what changes have I noticed over the last, it was a period of about 14 months that I was going to these conferences, and from the beginning to the end, you could definitely see some ideas that were on the fringe at the first conference become much more mainstreamed by the second and third conference. So the first conference played into a lot of hyperbole around attacks on, you know, transgender people, meaning attempts to restrict, you know, certain kinds of like hormones and surgeries for kids. And, you know, by the time I got to the European conference in Ireland in the spring, one of the opening speeches was about trans genocide, and that this was just this completely unsubstantiated, but also, you know, like focal point of the conference was that we're living through a trans genocide. So the atmosphere is getting more and more extreme, I think, more and more radicalized over time.
They use the word trans genocide. I'm sorry to be so ignorant, to mean what?
So this term gets thrown around a lot. As you might guess from what I've shared from the PR training, there's a reluctance to define certain terms, and transgenocide is definitely one of them. There are a lot of references to the different stages of genocide that researchers identified after the Holocaust around dehumanization and other steps that transgender activists will point to, but often when they're talking about dehumanization, they'll be talking about recognizing that people are still male and female. This seems like a pretty big leap to me. But basically the idea is that attempts to restrict access to certain interventions or to remove, for example, in the United States, Medicaid coverage from certain options, that these represent an attack on the existence of transgender people and the desire to prevent people from being transgender, and that that's genocide. Those of us who have studied the real thing would beg to differ. I haven't, I mean, not studied it in a serious academic way. It was the focus of my like teenage reading, and my undergraduate degree was studying, you know, the real Holocaust and the real eugenics movement in Nazi Germany. And let me just say, I don't see a whole lot of parallels.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would concur with you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're gonna stay in contact because I'm sure you're going to be keep working on this, or are you close to doing your writing on this, your dissertation?
I am close to finishing my academic work, but I imagine that I'll keep reporting. I still find it very interesting and important place to spend time.
Great. Well, we need it. We need it. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks everybody.